the heart and soul behind every business. Stories. Welcome to Business Story of the Week, hosted by me, Joshua Laurie. From setbacks to comebacks, from tragedies to triumphs, we inspire entrepreneurs through conversations that matter. Witness the magic that turns dreams into reality. Whether it's your career, business, or life, your success is always one story away. This is Business Story of the Week.
Hi, this is Bradley Sherman, and this is the business story of the week.
Fantastic. And that is the man himself, Bradley. He's going to be our guest for today. Of course, I am Joshua, your host. Bradley, are we looking at fewer babies and more retirees in the future?
That's already happening, and it's been happening
Wow,
for some time. Birth rates are down around the world in every
everywhere.
nation, including the nations that have the highest birth rates in sub Saharan Africa. This is a big change for society. And because of that, we've got a lot more older people at the same time, thanks to modern advances with medicine and public services.
Wow. Well, if it hasn't been a discussion now, we're going to be discussing that one today because the implications, right? We probably don't think of the implications so much, but Bradley is going to be helping us through that. He's going to be sharing to us what this, this demographic shift is going to do to our countries, to our nations, to our society. Bradley Sherman is the founder and CEO of Human Change, where he helps leaders tackle challenges related to demographic shifts like aging, birth rate decline, and migration. He authored The Super Age: Decoding Our Demographic Destiny, and is recognized for his thought leadership by the OECD, World Economic Forum, and major media outlets. And today, Bradley is going to be sharing his insight and his perspective with us, and really how important is it to address this demographic shift today. Bradley, thank you for coming on to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Bradley, before we really get into the future, or rather the present, I always like to start in the origins. I always like to start the origin story of what was the young Bradley Sherman like? Was he always looking into the future? Was he always interested in demographics? What would the young Bradley say to the Bradley of today?
He would say, "What the heck were you doing?" I think that'd be the first thing. You
Oh,
know, I have always been able to see patterns before other people do. And about 25 years ago, while driving across central Pennsylvania in the States, I noticed in this one small town, consistently there were a lot of older people working. And they were
interesting.
working at gas stations, at rest stops, in restaurants, while my grandparents were very comfortably retired back in Pittsburgh, my hometown. And I thought to myself, what's going on here? And I started to pick at it. And I found that in rural counties, in rural areas around the world, demographic change had been happening already. It's something that had happened because of urbanization and automation, but their birth rates had collapsed too. They'd have outward migration. And this was a trend that was going to develop over the coming years. And much like climate, those first people that said, hey, climate change is coming, they saw the patterns. I was in that same vein as it relates to demographics.
Okay, so you observe the age, you observe the demographics. I mean, first of all, people notice this every day, right? Like we've all seen the elderly working gas stations, the elderly probably working our convenience stations, but it probably never quite calculated to us. It's probably a normal thing, right? So why do you think that it's not such as a big deal to us right now, this demographic shift, and why do you think it's not being talked about more?
Well, I think that two things are true here. The first is that older people often kind of quietly disappear into the background. And if they are working, which, a larger percentage of older adults are today, a lot of times they're working in, jobs that are somewhat invisible too. It was years ago, I was traveling in South Korea, and I said to my host at the time, your taxi drivers here are really old. And
Mhm,
this is the
mhm.
CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And she said to me, are they? And I
Really?
will tell you, without any hesitation or reservation, these taxi drivers that I had in South Korea and Seoul were minimum age 65. Many of them were 75 or older. And I think that because we have this inherent bias against older people, because we tend to let them kind of disappear into the background, and those that are working in these jobs that sometimes disappear into the background too. There it's taxis, here it might be Ubers, it might be working in convenience stores as you suggest. We just don't see these people. They don't have the same kind of engagement with us. So we miss it. But on the other end of the spectrum, we're missing the fact that people are having fewer children, which is the other headline here. Or they're having children at a later date. And when I did the Today Show on NBC a few years ago, they said, well, tell us something that would surprise us. And I said, when's the last time you'd been to a park with your children? And they said, oh, just this morning. And I said, did you take a look at the parents in the park? Well, no. And I said, take a look next time. You'll find 18-year-olds and you'll find 50-year-olds, and they'll all have children of the same age. That's a big difference in the way we used to have children. We used to have children when we were young. Now we have them more when we're older. That used to be just for people with wealth that were able to
Yes.
do this. But now all economic groups are waiting.
I love how you used precisely, perhaps the number one example today, South Korea. And
Yes,
it isn't being talked often enough, but they are at the point where they probably wouldn't be able to replenish. There's a point. Correct me
they're
if I'm
already at
mistaken.
they're already
They're
at that
already at
point.
there.
Yeah.
They're already
So
at that
so
point. What is that term where they can't?
it's called the replacement rate.
There you go. The replacement rate.
And ladies, I'm going to apologize for putting some of the onus on you, but you are the ones that have the children. Every woman to replace the population needs to have about 2 children on average. In South Korea, women are having less than one child now on
Yes.
average.
Yes.
It's about 0.78, maybe zero point 0.7, maybe a little bit lower now. They've just revised some of the figures. But South Korea isn't the only story here. Birth rates in Asia are
Asia.
shockingly low. In
Very
China, they've fallen right off a cliff. Taiwan, they've fallen right off a cliff. And in countries you wouldn't really expect to have low birth rates, places like Thailand, places like Vietnam have birth rates at or below what countries in the West have. It's a surprise to people because if you travel throughout the region, if you've had the luxury to do that, it feels young in Asia. It feels very young, very future
truly.
focused. But that narrative doesn't add up to what's happening on the ground. People who are traveling through these places don't often go into the countryside. They don't see the reality of the
Yes.
countryside. And the
Yes.
countryside, my friend, is very, very old.
Mhm. Now, here's the thing. That what we're talking about. That we're talking about the replacement rate. We're talking about like the country not having enough children. Japan as well was leading in that list for quite a while. Now it's South Korea. It's now all over Asia. We're coming to that point like replacement rate. Like people are not having enough kids. So what? Right? That's a question. But now why? What is the implications of this? Why? It's quite obvious, but I think we need to get deeper into that to explaining that. Why is it affecting our society so much?
I don't think people realize how obvious it is. So I don't think it's as obvious as you might think.
Right.
The big thing is that if you don't have enough children and you keep everything else the same, people retire around 65, we have what's called a dependency ratio explode. And that means there are too few people working and paying and consuming goods and services to pay for those people that are not working. And what that does is it causes a drag on the economy. And that drag starts very slowly, but it picks up steam over time. And what you'll start to see is that taxes revenue will actually slow, social welfare programs will be threatened, businesses then will be threatened because they don't have enough customers. Younger people who are already struggling to have children today because of the cost of having children will be further pushed back. It can have the potential, and this is the big fear here, it can have the potential to collapse GDP, which is really scary if you're a capitalist. But more importantly, it has the fear factor of starting off a demographic doomsday cycle of sorts. And this is
Interesting.
yeah, and this is especially true in countries like China, like Korea, like Japan that do not have a history of immigration. In fact,
Hmm.
they're actually quite resistant to immigration. Some would say to some degree xenophobic.
Hmm. Hmm.
But without that influx of people coming in, these countries will shrink. And I mean, just to put a fine point on it, because I think it's important to talk in numbers that people can kind of
Please.
gasp at.
Yes, yes.
China lost 2 million people last year.
That's a lot.
And that's just from attrition. That's people dying. That's
Hmm.
people leaving the country. And the reality that they are not producing enough children
Hmm.
to maintain the population, much less grow it.
That's the thing. When we look at it from that perspective, like, okay, there's just more old people. There's more younger people as well. But, it feels normal, of course. Like, I can't have kids in this economy, and of course, we can't blame them. You can't blame them as well. Like, but the thing is, long term, what are now going to be the implications of this? You started mentioning all of that, and demographics, ages, they sort of come in waves, right? Like, so if the change was like a tidal wave, you mentioned some of those sectors earlier, but if the demographic change was a tidal wave and it's coming, it's happening, what shores would be hit the hardest? What would be these economies, this industry that would be hit the hardest? Who's prepared to ride those waves? How can we prepare to ride those waves?
No one is prepared to ride the waves.
That's the
No
thing.
one. Well, here's why. This has never happened before in human history.
Interesting.
So none of us are really prepared. We're certainly not mentally prepared for what this change might look like, but we definitely haven't prepared our systems for it. And here's the big problem. So much of this conversation for so long has been focused on the growing number of older people that it
Right.
hasn't really considered the down market effects. It hasn't really considered in the conversation what it really means for the economy, what it means for family creation, what it means for sectors like real estate. No one has really considered that. But, I'll give you another China fact. Because they had not considered the reality of their demographic change, and because they were so hot on the housing market there, they overbuilt housing by 65 million units.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy.
If you pay attention to the region at all, you know that that has really set off a ticking time bomb in that country right now.
Hmm.
But to put it in perspective for the global listeners, that's enough housing for everyone in France.
Wow. Wow.
Okay. So that is a big problem that they saw coming years ago. I visited there about 10 years ago now and met with one of the vice premiers and Jean and I. And we were talking about this. And I said, why is this not a big enough issue in China right now? And he looked outside to the polluted sky and said, there are bigger issues that we're facing right now. So
That's very interesting.
demographic change, just like climate change, it's what we call a slow moving trend. It really creeps along until it hits. And then all of a sudden, people can't ignore it. What you're seeing in certain sectors now, like the labor market, is people are starting to feel the pinch. They're starting to feel the pinch
Yes.
of decades of low births. So here in the United States, it led to quiet quitting. There's a great renegotiation happening between employers and employees because guess what? There aren't enough young people to fill all the slots of the
Yes.
retirees or the people who've been forced out due to redundancy. There simply aren't enough people. So that's put a real tight screw into the labor market here. Now, there's upsides to everything, right?
Right. Of course.
People will earn more money. Unions will have more negotiating power, but
Hmm.
that will also push up the cost of goods.
Of course.
So
Of
it
course.
will be a period of pain that we'll go through, and different countries will be better prepared to handle it than others. The United States, for one, has a little bit of a release valve here simply because we're
Interesting.
still a pro immigrant country. So our
Yes.
birth rates are low, but we continue to grow because we still have a open door policy of sorts for immigrants here.
Okay, all right. That's very, very interesting because now you're looking at a demographic shift in all of these parts of the world, but we're getting resources, so to speak. We're getting relief from all different parts of the world as well. But like you said, this is something that's not ever happened. The most obvious observation, of course, is like we're going to be taking care of older people, right? And I think no country or no GDP wants that, because you're going to be spending on trying to sustain older population that's probably not going to give back as much into the economy.
Yeah,
Now,
well, it's all,
as
and let's
Mhm.
be clear though, just for one
Go
second.
ahead,
Let me be clear here. There's one
please,
thing that people don't talk about is the
please.
hard decisions that we have to make. So in the 1980s, we talked about this when communism in Russia and the United States were still the great powers fighting against each other. There was this debate in Russia of guns versus butter. And it was really this, do you pay for national defense and security, or do you pay for consumer goods? They chose to pay for guns and security versus paying for consumer goods, and the thing collapsed on itself. Well, guess what? Now countries have this debate about paying for guns or grandma. It will be a national security question. And believe it or not, even in the United States, we are really struggling to meet recruitment goals for our armed services, even here.
Bradley, in your book, it's called The Super Age. Super Age. You mentioned how, I mean, you did also talk about how labor markets are going to be reshaped. And now we talked about like how are we gonna guns for grandma? How are we going to prepare for that? Like how are we going to shape our economy forward? You talked about also the pain points. Like it feels like a wave that's gonna come, and we're going to go through these pain points, and then only then will we see how we're going to react to it, how we're going to say adjust to it. Now, when it comes to predictions, Bradley, and I think that I feel like you're the expert to ask this, and this is quite the interesting topic. How do you think these predictions will evolve? And you talk about immigration as a kind of like a relief for United States, but how do you predict aging, or how do you predict aging to shape some of these markets? And again, like you said, no one's prepared, but how can we prepare?
So I think we evolve through test and learn. Like that's if you're a business leader, you focus on testing and learning, try and figure it out. We know the data. We know that we have a labor and skills gap to fill here. We know that we only have three real options for filling that gap. The first is extending the working life, so people work longer than they have. The second is increasing immigration. The third, which is the icky one, is that we lower the age of people entering the labor market downward. That's not one that people are too excited about.
Yes,
People aren't really
exactly.
excited about immigration either. So that leaves us with older adults. I think what's happening, I can tell you what's happening from the data, but I think what this is going to happen, what's going to progress with this is that we're going to see more and more people extend their working lives. And this is going to take us back to a historic norm. Believe it or not, prior to 1935, when Social Security was implemented in this country, most adults worked until they could no longer work, when they were physically unable to work.
Yeah.
We're going to see a return to that. And we're seeing a return to it already. In the 1990s, when I joined the workforce, when I was finishing up college, the labor force participation rate for over 65s was only 14%. Yet in the 1950s, it was 50%.
Mm.
Right now, it's about 23%, 24%. It will continue to grow over time. We're going to see more older people in the workforce. We're going to see more older people staying as consumers for longer periods of time. We're also going to see businesses really have to lean into inclusive design. Inclusive design is really hyped right now because, like, hey, let's try it. It's cool. It feels nice. It will move from a feeling nice to an economic imperative in a few years. And when you look at first movers, you look at the companies that are really like banging it out of the park. Automotive industry is banging it out of the park because older people still love to drive. The other company that is banging it out of the park is Apple. I mean, I cite Apple all the time because the inclusive design of their products is phenomenal. Just at the last Apple event, they announced that the iPods are now can be used as a hearing aid. They've been approved to be used as a hearing aid.
Wow,
But that's
fascinating.
just one of the things that they're doing. But they're also talking through an inclusive lens. Their advertising and their marketing actually matches the product. So people don't feel threatened by products that might be age inclusive by design. They
Love that.
embrace them. And guess what? The people with the most number of Apple devices, they're men over 65.
Wow. That is, I mean, that is genius. Well, more like preparation, like seeing what the inevitable coming. How do you prepare for it? How do you, take advantage of this? I mean, it seems like a big business opportunity would be aged care, home aged care, like making people are gonna have to take care of these older population.
That's part of it, but it's only
Mhm.
one part of it. There are really multiple parts to aging. There's the first wave when you enter your 50s in that immediate post-retirement years. You're not thinking about aging care unless you're putting money aside for it. That last stage of life is really when care comes into focus, when you need to
Yes,
have some kind of nursing care, some technologies that help you stay in your home for a longer period. The real economic opportunity right now, the one that is just golden, is 50 to 74s. And there's obviously some variability here, but let me tell you why. People to 74 are either at their peak income earning years or they're just recently retired. People who are recently retired spend as much or more for roughly a decade after retirement. And they're spending money on the stuff they want. They're buying for their kids, they're buying for their grandkids, they're going on vacation, they might be doing home modifications. That's the real sweet spot in the marketplace. Yes, we will always have to take care of an older population that is infirmed, but we never talk about the older population that is healthy. And that older population that is healthy, they are your future customer. They want to buy your goods, they want to come into your restaurants. But for some reason, when we design as young people, we don't think about them. So my recommendation to business, and we guide businesses through this, is talk to older adults. The best way you can talk to them, the best way you can engage them is by hiring them. But if you don't have slots to fill yet that you can fill with older talent, that experienced talent, do those focus groups, get out there and bring these people into the design process early and often because they're going to tell you exactly what they want. And guess what? It's not a phone with big buttons and it's not, some assisted device that looks like it was plucked right out of a hospital. That's not what they want. They want cool, sleek devices. They want BMWs. They want Apple phones. They want all the cool stuff that we are afforded to as young people. They want it too.
I love that. I love that perspective. That's literally overlooked. It's quite literally overlooked. No one talks
It is
about
the
that.
biggest blind spot right now in business, the biggest blind
Interesting.
spot. And really, quite frankly, anyone who's putting VC money into this right now, and there are some firms that are doing it, they're almost exclusively focused on the healthcare side.
Interesting.
Almost exclusively. You'll find a couple businesses. My good friend Tim Parr has this amazing eyewear company called Caddis. It is built for the midlife adult. It is designed by a person who's midlife. It is marketed by real people who are in midlife, and they're readers. They are cool looking readers, and you wouldn't know the difference if you had them on.
Wow. Wow. This is really, really cool stuff. I love that you pointed out that real blind spot. Again, like we're predicting into the future, we're trying to prepare better for this demographic change. If for our audience and listeners out there who wants to learn a bit more, the website is behumanchange.com. Bradley, any other predictions that we might get out of you? It's truly a fascinating concept, but it's less doom and gloom, so to speak. It's less doom and
It,
gloom than I expected.
yeah,
There's a lot more optimism there.
there's optimism and there's opportunity at every turn. And I always say that the one constant in life is change. And to help people better understand this change and how it intersects with other big issues of the day, really creating our new future. I've co founded a newsletter and podcast with my colleague, Marcia Stepanek, and you can find it at newrulesmedia.substack.com. And every week, we report on the big change that's happening on a number of different issues, helping to give people some sense of the world. It's data driven storytelling. It brings in expert analysis, and we really want people, both business leaders and lay people alike, to navigate this period because it's disruptive. It's very disruptive, a lot of new rules, and we've got a brand new future ahead of us.
behumanchange.com, and that newsletter, Bradley. We need to see another plug on that Substack. What
Yeah,
is
it's
it? Where
New
can we
Rules
find it?
Media. Yeah, it's newrulesmedia.substack.com.
newrulesmedia.substack.com. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure to go subscribe to that newsletter, learn more, go to his website. Bradley, where else can we find you? Where else can we learn more?
You can always find me on LinkedIn. My last name is SCHURM.
Fantastic, Bradley. This has been mind blowing. This has just been enlightening. I love it. One last bit of wisdom, one last bit of prediction into the future or now, what is happening. Take us home.
I think the biggest and most unreported item right now is mass internal migration thanks to climate change. And it's a story that's not being reported yet because the data is micro at this point. But every country, every person will be impacted by climate change. We saw just this week the terrible flooding in North Carolina in these low lying areas after Helene made her way north. There are only a few parts of the United States that are really considered to be safe. And those are in the Midwest. Those are around the Great Lakes. We have already started to see an uptick of people moving. That will continue to happen, I think, for the foreseeable future. So, will Detroit be the new Miami? That's TBD, but it certainly is positioned for a very bright future.
Right. I love that. I love that there's still some, again, bit of optimism and opportunity everywhere. It's not all doom and gloom. But Bradley, thank you so much for this perspective. Thank you so much for sharing this shift that we all need to prepare for. Talking about this, again, I was excited about this topic. It has delivered and more. Bradley, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
To all our audience and listeners out there, thank you for watching this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Again, behumanchange.com, newrulesmedia.substack.com. Go check those out, and we will see you on the next one. Bye bye.
All right, so here's the thing. We try to get a little bit better every day, but we can't do it without you. So if you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe below. And if you have any comments, just leave them in the space under.